Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Today I stand before you and will be moving the following motion at the end of my speech: that this Assembly calls upon the Government of Canada to amend the National Energy Board Act in order to stop the National Energy Board from including upstream and downstream emissions in pipeline approval assessments. Mr. Speaker, it is my pleasure to speak to this motion that I will be making. I should be able to just say that it is self-explanatory and doesn't need an explanation. But it would seem that our opposition would like to see that all things energy-related should be regulated and taxed to the point where any projects that would promote our economy moving forward to come to a complete halt. So here I stand having to explain why we need to make this request to the National Energy Board from including upstream and downstream emissions in pipeline approval assessments. Before I get started, I believe a definition of upstream and downstream emissions might be in order. Upstream emissions are the greenhouse gases given off by finding and producing oil, bitumen, and natural gas before they even get into a pipeline. And downstream emissions are the ones produced by the refining and burning of petroleum after it leaves the pipeline. Mr. Speaker, I would like to start with a quote from our Premier. "Today is not a good day for Canada. It is not a good day for the Federation. It is a very bad day for the West. TransCanada made the decision to cancel Energy East. But make no mistake, the reason for it falls at the feet of Prime Minister Justin Trudeau and the federal government. They have been, at best, ambivalent about the project and then moved the goalposts at the last moment by asking the regulator to consider the impact of upstream greenhouse gas emissions." Mr. Speaker, I believe it is our job, whether we are in power or sitting in opposition, to fight for what is right for our province, what is in the best interest of our economic future. Let's face it, if our economy is not doing well, the people of this province will suffer. Mr. Speaker, Saskatchewan's economy relies strongly on the production of commodity resources that require transportation to get to market. The national government reviews have grown to evolve considerations well beyond safety and marketplace needs for capacity. Under the new government, the transition systems reviews will now grow to involve the consideration of upstream and downstream emissions from the usage of products being transported, including products such as crude oil, natural gas, and refined petroleum products. Now let's just think about this for a minute. No other industry is asked to consider upstream and downstream emissions for the goods that need to be transported. Let me give you an example. Ontario and Quebec's economies rely strongly on production of manufactured goods, and these goods also require transportation to get to markets. What kind of goods, you may ask? Well, let's use cars and car parts that are manufactured in Ontario and Quebec. So the next logical question might be, how are they transported? These goods are transported via rail and road. If these goods were put under the same scrutiny before they were transported, such as crude oil, natural gas, or refined petroleum products are going to be, that would be a game changer for the car and car part industry. When I say a game changer, I do not mean in a positive manner either. It would be detrimental to that industry, just as it is detrimental to our oil and gas industry. Anytime a road or rail was repaved, rebuilt, or expanded, we would have to consider the upstream and downstream emissions from the usage of the goods carried on the road. We would have to examine whether the cars or car parts being manufactured and carried on the road would lead to more greenhouse gas emissions. But wait, that question is not being asked of cars or car parts. It's not being asked of planes or plane parts. It's only being asked of crude oil, natural gas, or refined petroleum products. Why? Why is our federal government picking winners and losers? I have heard on more than one occasion people who are a generation older than myself, my parents, my grandparents, talk about the first Prime Minister Trudeau. They would always talk about the negative impact his prime ministership had on the West. Could history be repeating itself? We live in this great, vast country we all call Canada, and each province in this country brings something different to the plate from an economic standpoint. I truly believe that we should all have a fair chance to get our products to market on a fair playing field. And the way things are set up right now, it is not a fair playing field. So the real question to be asked is why, for goodness sakes, are the things being produced and carried across Canada from Alberta and Saskatchewan facing the question of if these products will cause more emissions and being penalized for it, but those from Ontario and Quebec, cars and planes, are not even facing these questions in the first place. Now more than ever, we need to stand up for our province and stand up for the West. And we need to be doing this in a unified front. Like I stated earlier, whether we are in government or opposition, we need to stand for the economy of this province and the West. But instead of standing up for the right thing, what does the interim leader of the opposition have to say about the strong fight that our premier is putting up? Well, she says, and I quote, "Once again, the Sask Party has proven that their unbalanced approach, rhetoric and grandstanding have failed to get pipelines to Tidewater built and hurt the Saskatchewan economy at a time when 40,000 people in this province are unemployed and looking for work." Instead of mocking our premier's efforts, she should be joining in the battle.
Yeah, here.
And there was an article I read. It was entitled "Win National Energy Board Review of Energy East to Include Upstream and Downstream Emissions." In this article, there is a group called the Council of Canadians that is celebrating this decision. So I went to their website to see what they were all about, and it was quite enlightening, to say the least. What I learned while I was perusing their site was that they are a social action organization. I read lines such as, "Humanity is at a crossroads. We are the only species capable of profoundly altering the biosphere." But what I found most interesting was what I saw in their events calendar. Now, this might be a little bit of free advertising for them, but on November 18th, Mr. Speaker, in Windsor, Ontario, they're holding a panel discussion of the LEAP Manifesto. Well, I certainly found that intriguing. For those of you who may not be aware, the LEAP Manifesto is a document supported by the NDP, and I would argue its ideas are supported by the members opposite. And after you hear the highlights of the LEAP Manifesto, I would think we should all be afraid of this type of philosophy. The document is pretty much a war on the West and truly our economic future. Mr. Speaker, I was reading a Globe and Mail article that pointed out some interesting facts about the LEAP Manifesto, so I will just briefly go over what was contained in there. It says, the first point was they will be shifting away from fossil fuels so that Canada gets to 100% of its electricity from renewable resources, and then entirely weaned off of fossil fuels by 2050. I would argue that while it is important to have a renewable energy mix as part of our platform, we need to think of where we actually live, and is what the NDP proposing actually a reasonable expectation? I would argue not. We need to have reliable backup, or something we like to call baseload, for when other options are not working or available, and that baseload comes to us from coal or gas. And Mr. Speaker, they say they would like us to be weaned entirely off fossil fuels by 2050. What is their plan? To go back to the horse and buggy days? Or maybe even further back in time than that? If they want no fossil fuel usage by 2050, caveman days maybe, is that what they're shooting for? Secondly, they want no new infrastructure projects aimed at increasing extraction of non-renewable resources, including pipelines. So in essence, they want to completely shut down our oil and gas sector here in Saskatchewan. I don't know if they are aware, but this sector accounts for an estimated 35,000 direct and indirect jobs for 2017. The NDP is continually going on about the fact that our unemployment numbers are not improving fast enough. Well, if we follow this philosophy, we will have the highest unemployment rate in all of Canada. Our oil and gas industry contribute 15% to Saskatchewan's gross domestic product, and let's not forget the $600 million it contributed to our province's revenue last year. Revenues which funds things such as healthcare, education, and infrastructure for our province. Our opposition are always wanting us to spend more, and more, always telling us we do not do enough. What do they think will happen if these funds go away? Third, the LEAP manifesto wants us to expand low-carbon sectors of the economy such as caregiving, teaching, social work, the arts, and public interest media. I don't know how they can expect this to happen when they are trying to reduce the income that comes into the General Revenue Fund because they are opposed to extracting non-renewable resources. Fourth, the LEAP manifesto declares that austerity, which has systematically attacked low-carbon sectors like education and healthcare, while starving public transit and forced reckless energy privatizations, is a fossilized form of thinking that has become a threat to life on Earth. Mr. Speaker, I have no words for this bullet point. It is simply unbelievable. And lastly, a little earlier, I asked how they were going to pay for some of these proposals. Well, they actually answered that in the LEAP manifesto. They will be paying for it all by ending fossil fuel subsidies, imposing financial transaction taxes, increasing resource royalties, hiking taxes on corporations and the wealthy, introducing a progressive carbon tax, and cutting military spending. Oh, but I guess I digress a little, Mr. Speaker. Okay, well, maybe I digressed a lot. But I think it is important to put it all into context and make it clear who is fighting for this province and its economic future and who is working for the ultimate demise. So let's get back to the issue of pipelines and the regulations that are making it economically unfeasible to get a project started, let alone get it finished. The fact is that our world is growing, and the population is rising, and the demands of the consumer are going to increase, and we will need these products. The National Energy Board, the same people that have put these regulations in place, are predicting that by 2040, crude oil production is going to grow by 43%. So, Mr. Speaker, if we think rationally about what is going to happen, this oil is going to be transported, but it's going to be transported by truck or rail. This is going to put a huge strain on our existing infrastructure, which in turn will cost more in maintenance and repairs. I might also add that this is not the safest way to transport goods. I don't know how many of you remember the incident that took place in a community called Lake Mégantic, Quebec. Well, the reality is that if the oil is moved by pipeline, the odds of this incident happening would have gone down greatly. Mr. Speaker, according to Fraser Institute study, when you move oil by rail, you are 4.5 more times likely to have a spill. I really don't like the odds of that. And one other fact that I don't feel is out in the public enough is the fact that Canada's pipeline companies deliver 99.999, almost 100%, Mr. Speaker, of oil and gas they move without incident. It only makes sense that we would be moving these products by pipeline. Mr. Speaker, I would truly hope that the Government of Canada looks at the safety aspect of what a pipeline can do for our country. So I would pray that they do the right thing and stop National Energy Board from imposing these regulations. All we are asking is for a level playing field, and the oil and gas industry is not getting one. Mr. Speaker, to highlight what I've spoke about today, we have a Premier who is fighting for Saskatchewan and fighting for the West. We have an opposition that is not fighting for our province. It would appear as though the commodities in the West are being treated differently than those products in the East. We have an opposition that is tied to the LEAP manifesto, and if that doesn't scare you, it should. Pipelines are safer than rail or road. And lastly, all we are asking for is a level playing field. So, Mr. Speaker, that brings me to the motion we are here to do today. I would like to move that this Assembly calls upon the Government of Canada to amend the National Energy Board Act in order to stop the National Energy Board from including upstream and downstream emissions in pipeline approval assessments. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
Hear, hear.